Hi, I'm Stephen Prince. I'll be talking with you about Sanjuro. This is the second of two films that Kurosawa made about an exceptional samurai hero played by Toshiro Mifune. The character has slightly different names in each film. In the first film, Yojimbo, he's known as Kuwabatake Sanjuro, and in this one, he's known as Tsubaki Sanjuro. But it is the same character, and because Yojimbo was so enormously popular, and because everybody loved seeing Mifune in the role, Toho Studio encouraged Kurosawa to make a companion picture. He launched into it immediately with the same producers, Tomoyuki Tanaka and Ryuzo Kikushima, with Kikushima again co-writing the script and with many of the same actors in the cast. Tatsuya Nakadai once again as Mifune's nemesis, along with Takashi Shimura and Kamatari Fujiwara, and composer Masaru Sato returned and reprised his splendid musical theme. So the movie is a sequel to Yojimbo, of sorts. Kurosawa didn't want to repeat himself, so Sanjuro is quite different in its tone and focus than was Yojimbo. It's not the kind of sequel that directors make today, where the only difference is the number that follows the name of the title. We'll get to see Mifune do all of the things we love seeing him do, but Kurosawa has placed the character in a very different environment this time around than that god-forsaken town in Yojimbo. So the comedy and the conflicts that follow are pitched on a different register. In my commentaries on the two films, I'll talk about what Kurosawa wanted to achieve and how the two movies are complementary without being redundant. We're going to move propulsively into the story with two of Kurosawa's signature axial compositions, each shot taken along the same line of sight by the camera. Throughout his career, Kurosawa usually does these shots in groups of three, but in Yojimbo and Sanjuro, he does them in pairs, so that when we see them, they're quicker and not quite as elaborated as we find them in pictures like Seven Samurai and Ran. The shrine that we're going to be seeing in the first shot of the film is a real shrine. It's not a studio set. So we'll get two quick shots of that shrine, and then we'll move indoors. Here's one quick shot, and then the second axial shot. And now we're indoors, of course, on a studio set. The samurai gathered here are one group of principal characters. Their leader, center frame there, and center frame in the next shot here, is Izaka, who's played by Yuzo Kayama, whom Kurosawa used again very memorably as the young Dr. Yasumoto in Redbeard. They're very solemn, all very honorable, filled to the brim with bushido, and very foolish for all of that, as Kurosawa will spend the film showing us. He's going to use this group of youngsters to slyly mock the solemnity of the kind of samurai virtue that standard-issue period films typically salute. Kurosawa had turned period films on their head in Yojimbo, and he's going to continue undercutting their solemnity in Sanjuro, which is to say that this film too is a comedy, but not a dark one like Yojimbo. The humor in Sanjuro is more ironic, drier, and quieter. And it's a film with a complex moral, in which things are not what they seem, in which Kurosawa explores the differences between reality and the illusions that we have about it. The Chamberlain scolded Izaka, saying, "Be careful. People are not what they seem. Indeed, this is the moral of our story." Kurosawa will get right to that theme with Mifune's entrance, and with the way the young samurai completely misread his slovenly appearance. To them, taken in by appearances, he's a bum. As far as they're concerned, no self-respecting samurai would be so unkempt. And they're right, of course, at least in terms of the official ideology of Bushido. But Kurosawa intends to subvert this. Now we get a great entrance by Mifune. We hear him yawning and stretching back there in the shadows. And in just a minute, here he comes, shambling in from the shadows, sleepy and stretching. All of it a calculated affront to the exaggerated dignity of the youngsters. Sanjuro's entrance here is very different than in Yojimbo, where it was monumental and mythic. In the opening shot of Yojimbo, he looms into the frame, an extreme close-up, before a range of snow-capped mountains. The tone is epic. Here it can be smaller and quieter, more intimate, because we already know this character. He's an old friend whom we're delighted to see again. Kurosawa's compositions contrast Sanjuro's shambling posture with the rigidity of the young samurai, who stand together as a group, in contrast to Sanjuro's rebellious individualism. As he speaks, diagnosing their situation, Sanjuro reveals himself as a kind of Zen master, able with his insight, just as with his sword, to cut straight to the heart of things. He pronounces the chamberlain to be a good man, and the superintendent to be bad, just the opposite of what Izaku's bunch has concluded. He reaches this judgment intuitively because he knows that the youngsters, like people in general, are taken in by appearances. Therefore, the chamberlain must be unappealing in the way he looks, in contrast to the superintendent, and the fact that the chamberlain was not afraid to be judged a fool has confirmed for Sanjuro that indeed he's a wise man. Sanjuro's chain of reasoning also gives us insight into himself. It suggests that his appearance and behavior are calculated assaults on propriety, custom, and convention, because he has no patience with these things. His wisdom has taken him to a place of great insight into the human condition, to a deep understanding of the vanity of all worldly things. He does not value them, nor will he be taken in by them. He is therefore content to play the role of a kind of fool, speaking disreputable truth to power. Thus we have a rather different conception of the character in this film than we did in Yojimbo, where he is sly and tricky, but not deeply wise as he is here. His motives in Yojimbo are often selfish ones. Here they are quite altruistic. In Yojimbo he is a master swordsman. In Sanjuro he has mastered himself. These differences raise an interesting if minor question. Can the stories in the two films be sequenced chronologically? And if so, which comes first? Of course, it doesn't really matter. One of the most important things about adventure stories with a hero who isn't tied down is that he can be reinvented with each new episode. If, though, one is going to play this game of figuring out which story comes first, then in my opinion, the deepening of Sanjuro's character that we see in this film suggests that its story is subsequent to the one in Yojimbo. Now, in just a moment, Sanjuro is going to realize that they're all in a trap. You can see again the way Kurosawa contrasts the two groups of characters, the young samurai and Sanjuro, in terms of the composition. Typically, he'll set Sanjuro off in some area of the frame that differentiates him from the group. They all stand side by side across the length of the frame in that previous shot, and Sanjuro is there sitting. So when he realizes that they're in a trap, here, listen to the way that Mifune gives that great line reading, Nani, drawing it out, as Kurosawa adds more emphasis by using that tight close-up. Kurosawa had written this script before he made Yojimbo, and it originally followed the Shugoro Yamamoto novel from which it was adapted by featuring a hero who was not a master swordsman. But with Yojimbo's success, Kurosawa retooled the script, moving it away from the Yamamoto novel by incorporating the character of Sanjuro and adding lots more physical action like we've got now. And of course, Kurosawa knows we want to see Mifune in action. So we've got this nice scene where Kikui's men close in on the shrine, and Sanjuro realizes what's happening. Look at these quick flashes of the approaching men, and the reprise of the musical structure of Yojimbo by incorporating the bird sounds as part of the tempo of Sato's score. Kurosawa will be doing less of that in this film than he did in Yojimbo, where nearly that entire previous film was conceived in musical terms. And Sato's music is not quite as aggressive here, but really that's only because it was so over-the-top in Yojimbo. It is still very percussive, and with a range of unusual instrumentation that impressed Sergio Leone, who fashioned a relationship in his Dollars films with composer Ennio Morricone like what Sato has given Kurosawa here. I love this composition. It's really splendid. It reprises the intricate compositional use of architecture that was such a feature of Yojimbo. Mifune sits inside the little entryway there, whose shutters create a frame within the frame. And the low-key lighting on Mifune differentiates him strongly from the youngsters. And no doubt their heads are filled with propaganda stories like the legend about the loyal 47 Ronin who died fulfilling their samurai honor. They draw their swords preparing for battle just like the loyal 47, and Sanjuro pronounces Kurosawa's judgment on all of this by calling them foolish. And he moves the camera forward, tightening the frame around them while continuing to insist on Mifune's visual separation from the group. It's a little surprising that Kurosawa didn't use a wipe there instead of this cut. It's exactly the kind of spot that he'd typically use a wipe to emphasize the scene transition. But this is generally a quieter film without the many visual flourishes of Yojimbo. As Kikui's men close in, we have an unmistakable indicator of the different setting in this film compared to Yojimbo. This is a group of well-disciplined, honorably groomed, and obviously employed samurai. We saw none like them in Yojimbo, whose characters were mainly scruffy ronin, gangsters, gamblers, riffraff, and street trash. It was a much lower-class world in Yojimbo. Here, by contrast, we're atop the Tokugawa-era class pecking order, amid gainfully employed samurai. Kurosawa is not going to keep his audience waiting long to get Mifune into action. He knows that's what we want to see, and so we're going to get right to it. We get some splendid bits here as Sanjuro gets angry and knocks Kikui's men around like bowling pins. A couple of great shots where he flips them back and forth. And then Kurosawa will give us a magnificent pair of reverse field shots with Sanjuro looming atop the steps of the shrine. All of the perspective flattened by the telephoto lens. Here's one of them. That's a really fantastic looking shot. When he wades into the crowd, Kurosawa will use only 2 camera setups to capture the action, cutting back and forth between them. And what's really interesting about the scene is that Sanjuro keeps his sword in its sheath. He's pulled the sheath from his kimono and has not extracted the sword from it. He's fighting without baring the blade of his weapon, and his ability to prevail so easily this way reveals his mastery of the art of kendo, or in this case more properly, jojutsu, since he is using his sword like a jo, a long stick that is closely related to the sword in martial arts history. I'll say more about these fighting techniques later in the film. Also, later in the film, we will hear some important dialogue about the merits of keeping your weapon sheathed. This idea is the core philosophy of the movie, and we see here that Sanjuro is already receptive to this idea. So now we've got Tatsuya Nakadai making his entrance as Hanbei Moroto, a mid-rank samurai who's working for the bad guys. He and Sanjuro are the film's most ferocious warriors, and as such, he's Sanjuro's main adversary. Nakadai's role in this regard is a reprise of his role in Yojimbo, even though the character is quite different. Here he's a formidable samurai. In Yojimbo, he was a gangster who fought with a pistol, not a sword. But in both films, Kurosawa pairs Mifune and Nakadai as antagonists, and in this he started something of a trend because they square off again in Masaki Kobayashi's Samurai Rebellion. And in Kihachi Okamoto's Sword of Doom, Nakadai decides to sit out the fight with Mifune, maybe because he's been losing all of them. Kurosawa and Sato reprise the musical Mickey Mousing of Yojimbo as our young samurai emerge from beneath the floorboards. Mickey Mousing refers to a cartoonish use of music that catches each action with a musical cue. And we've got a magisterial shot here of the 9 samurai bowing in obeisance to Sanjuro. This is what great widescreen filmmaking is all about. It's not just a matter of filling the frame, although even that is something directors today have trouble doing because so many films are inappropriately shot in this screen ratio. But it's a matter of using the space wisely and meaningfully. As he's done before, Kurosawa gives us a thematic and visual contrast between the young samurai, clustered as a group, and Sanjuro sitting as an individual. They form 2 distinct units in the frame, and Kurosawa has lined the youngsters up across the width of the frame as a way of describing their conformity, in this case, to the ideals of their class that they think they should follow. It's very much Kurosawa's point that the young samurai behave as a group and be relatively undifferentiated. That's because in this they are the personification of groupthink, of naive class-bound thinking. They've been programmed by the ideology of the Tokugawa era, which was a period that glorified Bushido, even wrote its codes down for the first time, and formulated numerous rules about how ideal samurai should behave. Samurai should live frugally, avoid drink and gambling, loyally serve their lord and master, and devote themselves to duty above all else. This is what the youngsters think they ought to do, so the fact that they often behave as a herd serves Kurosawa's satiric point. When Sanjuro asks them for money, it's an affront to their notions of proper samurai behavior. Even though samurai in the period might be paid in coin for service to their lord, they clearly expected Sanjuro to take everything that was in the purse because they're seduced by appearances. He looks like a bum, but Sanjuro only takes what he needs and returned the rest to them. Again, there's a difference here relative to Yojimbo. In that film, when he took money, it was a mercenary act. He was out to rob the merchants and gangsters of their ill-gotten gain. Here, though, he's far more circumspect about the taking of money, far more disciplined about it. So now, with the righteousness that keeps them continually aflutter, the 9 young samurai resolve to go to Izaka's uncle's house and try to rescue him. But Sanjuro knows they're walking into a trap, so he'll accompany them as protection. And we get a twitch and a roll of his shoulders, the characteristic gestures that Mifune used in Yojimbo, and this fast tracking shot of the young samurai on the run. Kurosawa often wipes in the same direction of the movement in the incoming shot, but here he wiped in the opposite direction. Now again, we're going to see how different Sanjuro's motivation in this film is compared to Yojimbo, where he does little without asking for money. Here, he's accompanying the young samurai as a protective mentor for entirely altruistic reasons. He stands to gain nothing from his efforts, not even the downfall of villains whose destruction in Yojimbo he arranged for his own amusement. There are villains in this film to be sure, but they're not grotesques and monsters as they were in Yojimbo. They're rather more benign. This is an elaborate indoor set. Kurosawa shot some exteriors for the film, like the shrine that opens the picture, but a lot of the scenes were done indoors, even if the action was taking place outside. Despite this, it was a very quick shoot, about 3 months with another month in post-production, and then the film was in theaters. So it was a very fast and relaxed shoot for Kurosawa, and it came between the 2 larger-scale pictures, Yojimbo and High and Low, affording him an opportunity to have a good time. Now we're coming up on one of the best sight gags in the movie. It's what people sometimes refer to as the Centipede Joke. When Sanjuro gets up to move, as he does here, you'll see the youngsters fall into line behind him just like a long centipede. This always gets a big laugh from audiences, and it's another spot where the humor depends on the youngsters acting like an ensemble in comparison to Sanjuro's individualism. So they resolve to head to the barn, and Kurosawa once again is going to place his camera behind some shrubbery to make the set look a little more dense and complicated. And he gives us an eloquent visual contrast between the youngsters skulking and slinking against the barn and Sanjuro striding into the frame, shot in the kind of low-angle perspective that was such a hallmark of Yojimbo and that we'll see more of later in the film. When they all move into the barn, Kurosawa will arrange the young samurai around Koiso in the kind of style that he often favors for group shots of characters. You see it here. Characters who are defined in the story more in terms of their class or group identity than as individuals. They're treated as a single visual unit, in this case arranged in a tiered formation, with everyone's attention uniformly focused on Koiso. This recurring compositional style in Kurosawa's work is always used as a way of visually defining a group, or establishing a connection of identity among a group of characters who are not well individuated. Kurosawa uses this approach in the way he frames the farmers in Seven Samurai, in the way he shoots the hospital patients in Redbeard, and in the way he films the large hall of policemen in Stray Dog and High and Low. Typically, he contrasts the group with his protagonist, the hero who is individualized, as he does here by having Sanjuro withdraw a ways from Koiso and the samurai and recline on a bed of straw in the foreground. As important as the group is for Kurosawa, the individual hero is just as important because the two define one another in a relationship of tension. Kurosawa's protagonists become heroes because they break with the normative groups in Japanese society that typically furnish one's identity. The heroes tend to subvert these groups by questioning their values and ideals, and that's exactly what Sanjuro is doing here with the codes of Bushido and his continuing mockery of the youngsters. So Kurosawa dramatizes this tug-of-war between individual and group. He visualizes it in the compositions that contrast the unity of groups with the heroes who stand outside their orbit, who pull away, who do not assimilate. In some films, the outcome is tragic. The heroes are destroyed because of their solitude in pictures like Record of a Living Being and The Bad Sleep Well. In others, though, like Sanjuro, the hero successfully undermines the ideals that everyone else takes for granted. This is Kuni Tanaka as Yasukawa scolding Mifune in another splendidly framed composition that continues the design strategies of Yojimbo. placing characters in tiny window frames. Although Kurosawa is working with a different cinematographer on this film, he's carried over these designs as a way of linking the two films together visually. Kuni Tanaka's character is Izaka's main rival in the group of young samurai. Yasukawa is considerably more impulsive and temper-driven than Izaka, and Tanaka has a really interesting and odd face that Kurosawa makes good use of. He used him again in Dodeskiden, and Tanaka also appeared in 2 remakes of Kurosawa films in the 1970s, Sanshiro Sugata and Stray Dog. So we fluidly move the camera up as Mifune stands, and we're in another shrewdly conceived composition, with 2 planes of diagonal lines slicing through the frame at the top and bottom of the screen. The characters are clustered between them, with the same visual contrast between individual and group that we've seen before. This is shrewd filmmaking. Kurosawa shifts between 2 striking compositions with minimal fuss. You can find a lot of these actors moving in and out of many of the samurai films in the period. Kuni Tanaka and Yuzo Koyama appear in a number of Kihachi Okamoto's films, often with co-stars Tatsuya Nakadai and Toshiro Mifune. So there is something of a kind of little ensemble group of samurai movie actors here that was really flourishing in the period. That's a really nice wipe there, nice flourish with Sato's music again Mickey Mousing the action as it did earlier when the youngsters popped out of the floorboards. And now we get some heroic shots of the young samurai on the run, the only time in the film that they get this kind of visual respect. Superbly choreographed action highlights this little montage. They dash in different directions. I especially like these 4 shots of individual samurai running in opposite directions on diagonals, succeeded by a splendid shot of one coming toward us across the bridge there. Really nice contrast. Then Kurosawa leaps forward in time with everyone assembled for the raid. Our earnest little group eagerly outfits itself for the fight, while Sanjuro thinks out a plan. Wisdom and contemplation need to assert themselves over blind action, a lesson the youngsters have not yet learned. So Sanjuro formulates their plan and then scolds them for looking disappointed. You can see again how effective Kurosawa's compositions are. He's got Kuni Tanaka as Sanjuro's main antagonist within the group of samurai at frame opposite, so they're sort of opposing one another visually there in the picture. And before we go to the next scene, Kurosawa makes very good use here of Tanaka's perpetual hangdog expression. Sanjuro has succeeded in getting the guards drunk, and their boisterousness is going to arouse Moroto to come outside. Sanjuro is pretty sly. It's evidently a slow night in the castle town, and the guards are bored, so he was pretty correct in suspecting that they would take enthusiastically to the liquor that he's offered them. So they're carrying on, and Moroto comes out, and as he does, Kurosawa is going to show us why he's such a good samurai, despite being a villain. His sobriety contrasts with the behavior of the guards, whose drunkenness is a violation of the law. At the beginning of the Tokugawa era, the shogun Ieyasu in 1615 formulated what he called the rules for military houses, and these included an injunction against drunkenness and gambling because these behaviors were seen as weakening the state by creating lax discipline amongst its soldiers. Moreover, throughout the period there were numerous Confucian injunctions against drunkenness, and so the behavior of the guards, coming as it does in this high-level military installation, suggests the weakening of central authority in the late Tokugawa period and the erosion of samurai standards. Moroto, however, stands out in his self-discipline as a good warrior. He is abiding by Ieyasu's rules for military houses. And so now, when Moroto does come back outside again, you can see how angry he is. He learns that even his interior guard has been drinking. They come out and he gives them the old DUI test and is quite upset with them. And he orders them to wash themselves off, essentially to wash the stain on their honor off. So he sends them to the pond, and there will be essentially sitting ducks for Sanjuro to attack. He's got to really stare them down first. These poor guys. And then he's going to go off to confront the other guards, leaving the pussycats without the tiger to thwart Sanjuro's attack. Now, what's coming up here is going to happen so fast that in order to talk about it, talk about what Mifune is doing with the sword in some detail, I've got to kind of do it afterwards. So watch how quickly all this takes place. It's all over in just a flash of a moment. Ryu Kuze's choreography, Ryu Kuze is the swordplay instructor on the film, has been carefully worked out in terms of classic kendo moves. So let me take a moment now and talk about what we've just seen. While the action of the attack is so fast that it's hard to see what happens, Mifune in fact made 5 strikes. Sanjuro's first strike is a tsuka ate, a kendo term that designates a thrust with the butt end of your sword's handle, the tsuka, into the enemy's solar plexus. We've seen him do this before. It's a feature of his attack outside the shrine near the film's beginning. Sanjuro uses the move here to take out the first guard. He'll be taken prisoner. Then Sanjuro executes a thrust in the reverse direction using the kojiri, the sheath's sealed end, to strike the third guard in the solar plexus. In his third move, Sanjuro then draws his blade and makes a yohogiri, a horizontal cut from left to right, into the second guard. He then executes a kiriotoshi, a downward cut from top to bottom, into the third guard, and finishes with another horizontal cut across the front of the second guard. These 5 distinct moves are carried out with fluidity and an economy of motion. Mifune was a very skilled physical performer, and this is one reason he was ideal for chambara or swordplay films. He had the charisma to play heroes of mythic stature and the physical grace to execute a flurry of complex moves without waste. In Yojimbo, Kurosawa slightly undercranked the action in the scene where Sanjuro attacks a room full of opponents in order to make things look fast. But here there was no undercranking, which gives you one idea about how quickly Mifune could move. It's a very fast-paced attack. Almost in the blink of an eye, it's over. And it works wonderfully well as a means for showcasing Sanjuro's prowess with a sword. This is one of the film's most remarkable scenes, with such a delicate tone and delicious sense of irony. The rough, sweaty Sanjuro, with blood fresh on his sword, overhearing the gentle murmurings of Chidori and her mother, who has never been in a barn or around hay in her life. She is the wife of the chamberlain, one of the highest-ranking samurai in the film, and as such she is used to finer things. And Kurosawa gives us this wonderful shot of Sanjuro, looking a bit like an imp, peering at the ladies nestled in the hay. Kurosawa shows us that he can portray delicacy very well, that he can be a delicate director as well as one who handles hard action. So Kurosawa brings the two worlds together, Sanjuro's violence and the refined perspective of Chidori's mother, when the group brings in their prisoner. In another dry joke, Kurosawa has Izaka point out that they've been trying to choke the information out of him using the pond, but he won't talk. So Sanjuro tells them to kill him. It'll be a kind of battlefield execution, and this prompts the old lady to say no, they mustn't do that. She asks Sanjuro if he killed the guards, and as he admits to doing so, Kurosawa puts them in the frame here, but at opposite ends, on opposite sides. She says that killing people is a bad habit, that Sanjuro's problem is that he's too violent, like a sword that cannot remain in its sheath. The best swords, she tells him, remain in their sheaths. It's an extraordinary moment, and it's one that everyone remembers. The movie has been sly and subtle and ironic all along, but now it opens into real complexity, with this perspective coming just after Kurosawa has allowed us to thrill to Sanjuro's prowess in action. The old lady offers a more humane perspective than Sanjuro is used to encountering in the world that he inhabits, and the film vindicates her outlook. She invites Kimura, the hostage, to come with her, and he turns out to be a very decent fellow, not at all the villain that we might think he is. So her words and policy reveal a truth behind appearances, that Kimura is very much worth saving, appearances that this time around had seduced even Sanjuro. This scene really is the moral center of the film. It is the ethical heart of the movie, and it suggests that Kurosawa's own outlook on violence was complex and nuanced. On the one hand, he loved the samurai world that he put on the screen and was privileged to bring to life. Violence was part of that world, and as a filmmaker, Kurosawa enjoyed staging action scenes. He was superb at it. He was one of the world's great epic poets of screen violence. But he was also troubled by what he came in later years to view as the unending human propensity for killing, which he thought was timeless and universal. Ran is his great lament about that. And by that time in the mid-1980s, he had moved away from putting on screen scenes of heroically violent action. This, too, is another kind of classic moment in the film where Sanjuro allows her to step on him climbing over the wall. And her language is very formal. It's a very formal series of apologies that she gives to Sanjuro. So in these scenes, at the heart of the film, we find our first real indicator of the shifting currents within Kurosawa. The old lady's point of view points at a different kind of world, a much better one than the one that we inhabit, and a condemnation of this world of violence. Kurosawa lets us see a different reality, like what we have near the end of Seven Samurai, when farmer and samurai overcome their animosity and form a cooperative community. But it's only a glimpse. It's here and then it's gone, trumped by the wickedness of this world. In this film, though, the old lady's words will linger as ones that Sanjuro cannot forget, and in the film's last scene, we will see how haunted by them he remains. So Sanjuro accompanies the young samurai to a mansion that adjoins the home of the chief conspirator, Kurofuji. This section of the film will highlight the major difference in the story's setting compared with Yojimbo. That film took place in a desolate town out in the country, far from a city. Here, though, the action takes place in a castle town typical of the Tokugawa era. Samurai in this period lived in castle towns, which is where we find them in Sanjuro. Since 1588, the countryside had been disarmed. Farmers were forbidden to carry weapons. This effectively cut samurai off from the land, and regional lords began consolidating their soldiers within the fortified areas of a castle town. Each domain typically had only one, following an order from the shogun in 1615, ordering the destruction of all castles except one per domain. Samurai made up the bulk of the inhabitants in these towns. In 1810, for example, the town of Tottori had 35,000 residents, and 25,000 of these were samurai. Sandai in 1872 had 50,000 residents. More than half were samurai. The castle towns, then, were first of all military garrisons, and we'll see evidence of this shortly in the film. But they were also centers of bureaucracy and government for the lord's domain, with high-ranking samurai serving as administrators. The chamberlain is a chief executive for the daimyo, or lord of the domain. The lord, however, is currently away from the domain in Edo, the capital of Japan, and the city where the shogun resided. The central Tokugawa government required all regional lords to spend a lengthy period each year in residence in Edo. It was a way of controlling the provinces, but in the film, the lord's absence has given the conspirators an opportunity to try to unseat Izaka's uncle from power. And now Kurosawa is going to reprise the delightful scene in Yojimbo, where Mifune is asked for his name. In reply to the old lady's query, he looks at the camellias outside, and he replies, Tsubaki Sanjuro, which is a nonsense name meaning essentially camellia 30 years old. And the filming is exactly the same the way it was in Yojimbo. There, he looked out at a mulberry field and replied, Kuobatake Sanjuro, which meant mulberry field 30 years old. So we've got Mifune look out the window, we drop in 2 shots of the camellias and the mulberry field respectively, and then a cut back to Mifune delivering his joking reply. And each scene is scored with similar musical cues by Sato. So Kurosawa was clearly thinking of Yojimbo and Sanjuro as films linked not only by their central character, but by recurring features of style, which included jokes, compositions, camera setups, and musical cues. Now you hear that bird call. We've been hearing it throughout the scene. It's a bird's call that would be very familiar to the film's Japanese audiences, and we'll continue to hear it throughout this scene. The call is very distinctive and belongs to the uguisu, or the bush warbler, sometimes known as the Japanese nightingale. It's a famous bird that appears in Japanese prints and poetry as a harbinger of spring. In haiku, for example, its name is one of the kigo, or seasonal words, in this case marking early spring. And that's how Kurosawa uses it here. He does the same thing in Redbeard, where following a long and harrowing sequence set in winter, he gives us shots of blossoming trees, and on the soundtrack, the call of the uguisu. Kurosawa again reprises the frame-within-a-frame compositional design from Yojimbo in this shot of our two principal conspirators, Kurofuji and Takabayashi, played by Takashi Shimura and Kamatari Fujiwara. This casting is also a reprise from Yojimbo, where Shimura and Fujiwara played two of that film's chief villains, a pair of merchants who were allied with Yakuza gangs. And our third conspirator, Kikui, is going to enter in just a minute with bad news. He's played by Masao Shimizu, who appeared in small roles in numerous Kurosawa films. There's Shimizu there. These films included Drunken Angel, Stray Dog, and High and Low. His most memorable appearance, though, is as the doctor in Akira, who tells Watanabe, the old clerk, who has cancer, and who was played by Takashi Shimura, that he merely has a light stomach ulcer. Kikui bears the bad news that the Chamberlain is being stubborn and is resisting their efforts to make him sign a false confession. Now note that Kurosawa doesn't really go into much detail about the nature of the conspiracy, or about the corruption within the clan. These things are not really very important in the film. It's a small local conspiracy that Kurofuji and his pals are plotting, and Kurosawa's focus instead is on the young samurai and their relationship with Sanjuro, who teaches them about the nature of the world. So the young samurai deduce that because all of the conspirators are next door, it follows that their uncle must be held there as well. And we cut now to this splendidly framed composition where Maroto comes to report. This one, for example, is quite ostentatious, given the way Kurosawa leaves large areas of the widescreen frame relatively blank, filled in only by the paneling and walls of the house, accentuating the small window box that is our area of focus. The reverse field shot of Maroto is less ostentatious, this one here, but it's still consistent with the compositional design that helps to link this film with Yojimbo. Maroto tells the others that he has armed men covering their houses in case the young samurai try and attack. There is an important difference between Maroto and, to a lesser extent, Kikui on the one hand, and Kurofuji and Takabayashi on the other. Maroto and to some extent Kikui are physically skilled as warriors, whereas Kurofuji and Takabayashi appear much softer and sedentary. You really wouldn't want them at your side in a fight. This difference reflects the evolution in the world of the samurai during the Tokugawa period. Because the castle towns were the administrative centers for a lord's domain, the highest-ranking samurai became bureaucrats running the local government. The shogunal authority in Edo allowed the domains considerable freedom in running their own affairs, and so many samurai spent their time as civil servants rather than warriors. And even those who still ostensibly functioned as soldiers found that there was precious little fighting to be done. So as you can see here, Kurofuji and Takabayashi look soft. This is an indicator that they are very high-ranking civil servants. They are samurai, but not fighting men like Maroto and Kikui. Sanjuro and the samurai hear the drum and they realize that something has happened to affect their plans. This would be the large kettle-like drum used at castle fortifications to spread news of urgent events. During preceding centuries of samurai warfare, the large drums were mounted in open towers of castles or fortress mansions, and smaller drums were carried on the backs of soldiers in the field. Along with trumpets made from conch shells, the drums were used as a means of using sound to convey urgent information about battlefield events. So our drum here has heralded a preemptive strike by Kikui and Maroto. This is a strikingly different composition than any we've seen before. The young samurai are sitting encircling Sanjuro, who is the center point of the circle. The composition is a visual emblem of unity and oneness, and it contrasts with the way that Kurosawa has been filming them before. In earlier scenes, the samurai have been lined up across the frame in a strict fashion that symbolized the rigidity of their thinking, and Sanjuro has never been a part of their grouping on screen. He's always been marked off into a different area of the frame. But in that circle shot, Kurosawa showed them all together as one, suggesting the degree to which the young men have come to rely on Sanjuro and trust him. We're not out of the woods yet. The youngsters are still going to quarrel among themselves about what to do and even ignore Sanjuro's advice. But that shot was an important transitional one that talked about the evolution in Sanjuro's teacher-pupil relationship with the young men. The circle shot is also very reminiscent of things Kurosawa had done in Seven Samurai. He used a circle motif there in camera moves, in the way he grouped characters on screen, in architecture, to visually develop themes of unity and community. And this is one reason he's such an extraordinary filmmaker. He thinks visually. His themes and ideas are worked out in cinematic ways. His camera work and compositions become metaphors for the underlying issues of a film. So now Kikui hatches his plan. He's going to use the Chamberlain to lure the young samurai out in the open, and it shows how resourceful he is. It's his effort to reply to Kurofuji and Takabayashi, who are worrywarts. They hold a higher rank than he does, but they're not as ruthless. At least they don't have the stomach really to do what needs to be done to consolidate their power. So Kurosawa spends a fair amount of time setting up this ambush, with Kikui making things very clear. And that's because he likes process. A very elegant sequence now. We get a tilt down, get an axial cut to this framing of the young samurai watching the palanquins on the move, and then we get a right angle cut, changing our line of sight by 90 degrees there. And then we're going to get another right angle cut that will take us back into the same pairing of axial shots that we've just seen. And now one of the most expansive camera moves in the film, a tracking shot to the right that creates an analogous point of view composition here to the one that opened the sequence. This is a wonderfully intricate little sequence that shows Kurosawa having some fun narrating this section of the story. And Sato's music is full of satirical pomp and heroism. As the youngsters rush about reporting on events, Kurosawa launches into a funny little montage, composed of 5 vignettes all linked by wipes, in which poor Sanjuro's efforts at taking a nap are disrupted by the scurrying and chattering of the samurai. Mifune's reactions are wonderfully subtle, almost deadpan, little comic masterpieces. And part of the joke is that it doesn't really matter who's chattering excitedly with the latest news. The youngsters are all alike, and so the camera stays on Mifune, giving us only glimpses of feet and kimono bottoms as they dash in and out. They're all quite mindless. Their immaturity and blind belief in Bushido have left them so. Only Sanjuro keeps his head, and when he manages to wake up, he smells a trap. The young samurai's headstrong belief in duty and in their own abilities has set back the mentoring that Sanjuro has aimed to do. And so here you see we return to our earlier compositional strategies, framing Mifune and the samurai so that the discord between them is manifest visually. He reclines in the background on a horizontal that contrasts with the verticals that they establish in the foreground. They are no longer unified, functioning as one. And when Izaka suggests they go and attack, Mifune agrees to accompany them on the grounds that it will keep him awake. But this is a pretext. What he really has in mind is to look out for them, to watch over them. Now, an interesting question is why? Why is he so persistent in trying to safeguard their welfare? If we think beyond the mechanics of the story, I think we find in Sanjuro's alliance with the youngsters a statement by Kurosawa, or a wish, in regards to the generational dynamics that were then at work in the world of Japanese film. In the late 1950s and throughout the 60s, a group of younger filmmakers began their careers with work that was more radical, more stylistically assertive than the pictures that Kurosawa's generation had been making. And for numerous reasons, partly having to do with the size of Kurosawa's reputation and his place in the world of film, they sought to carve out a space for themselves by not affiliating with Kurosawa or his work. As a result, Kurosawa began to feel left out, unappreciated by this younger generation, for whom he would have liked to be a mentor. These feelings persisted and intensified over the next decades, and they become very strong influences on the drama and the stories in later films, most especially Ran and Madadayo, which are pictures about generational relationships between an old man and young acolytes. The portrait is presented in negative terms in Ran and in very positive terms in Madadayo. And so we can see the beginnings of this focus in Sanjuro, in Mifune's relationship to the young samurai, which is the foundation of the film. So too the question of why Sanjuro is so persistent in trying to help the youngsters, why he remains so loyal to his role of mentor. One answer is that this is the relationship that Kurosawa wanted to have with the generation of up-and-coming filmmakers. But he was not able to, and so this aspect of the film has the quality of a wish, of an ideal that was desired but was not to be fulfilled. This group of samurai arrive intent on protecting the palanquins from threat by the chamberlain's men, and Kurosawa aggressively cuts to a tighter framing so that the horsemen seem to pass by very close to the camera. Some of the noises that the horses make sound a little familiar, perhaps coming from the Toho Studio sound effects library, because they seem a bit like what we've heard in Seven Samurai. The shot of Kikui's men rushing out from behind the fortifications will show the extreme perspective compression from Kurosawa's long focus lens. Here we go, they come out, and you can see how compressed and foreshortened that action is. They all seem to be running in place, a stylized effect that Kurosawa really liked and repeated in other films. Then we cut to this closer framing of the guards using an even longer focal length setting. Samurai continue to pour out of the fortification behind them, and we cut to a low-angle shot between the legs of the horses that reprises those memorable shots from Seven Samurai. Now, those reaction shots of Sanjuro and the youngsters behind the shrub are likely studio interiors that have simply been intercut with all of this exterior footage that we're seeing. Now, Sanjuro gets up to leave, and Kurosawa includes this quick but very artful composition that frames him within a center panel or window created by the branches of that shrubbery. So now they all creep off, and we go back and we find Kimura is out of the closet. It's a scene that vindicates the wisdom of Chidori's mother, the chamberlain's wife. The young samurai find him untied, completely free, dressed very well, and enjoying a pleasant meal. And when they ask him what's up, he points out that the old lady took pity on him, gave him a good kimono belonging to one of his captors, and a meal. And the key point, because she trusted him, he felt obligated not to betray her trust by escaping. So Kimura is a moral individual and a reflective one. He tells them that what he's seen and heard there is contrary to what Moroto and Kikui have told him. So in one of the film's most delicately funny moments, he helps himself to another bite, and then he bobs respectfully and gets back in the closet, flashing a sheepish hangdog look at the camera before closing the panel. It's really delicious. This kind of gentle, subtle humor distinguishes Sanjuro from its predecessor, Yojimbo. Both films are comedies, but the humor in Yojimbo was much broader and more cartoonish. Here it's quieter and in many ways more finely observed. Moreover, both films are ironic, but in Yojimbo the ironies were savage and caustic. Here they are mellow. So Kimura's behavior shows us that he's a fellow who was very much worth saving. He might easily have been executed, as Sanjuro advised doing, and so the implication of the scene is that many other men, perceived as villains and subsequently killed, would reveal their humanity if given the chance to do so. The old lady's caution to Sanjuro about not using too much violence has a sound basis. Violence obliterates the humanity of its targets. Villains are not always what they appear to be. This was Sanjuro's advice to the youngsters at the beginning of the film, made in reference to the chamberlain. But now the axiom cuts in a different direction, and in a way that Sanjuro had not been prepared for. People are not what they seem. The actor playing Kimura is Keiji Kobayashi, and it's a very sly, ingratiating performance. But this was Kobayashi's only appearance in a Kurosawa film. Otherwise, he had a lengthy and very prolific career as an actor, appearing in more than 150 movies of all stripes, even including pictures about the venerable Godzilla. And yet another great composition here, with everyone facing in different directions, one of Kurosawa's trademark ways of grouping characters, with Mifune reclining while everyone else sits, an effective way of giving us a visual distinction between Sanjuro and his protégés. Mifune's posture here, leaning on one elbow with his back to the camera, is a motif that Kurosawa had used throughout Yojimbo and carries into this film. Film critics and fans who discuss these movies sometimes suggest that there is some ambiguity about whether Mifune is playing the same character in each film. Perhaps because Kurosawa gives him different names in the two films and the settings are so different. But all of the elements of design, from the camera work to Mifune's gestures and posture, are telling us that it's the same character. I don't think it's ambiguous at all. Toho wanted Kurosawa to bring Sanjuro back for a second appearance, and so he did. So now a division breaks out amongst the young samurai for the first time in the film. Izaka and Yasukawa each come to head different factions, with Izaka loyal and deferential to Sanjuro, having realized something about the difference between reality and appearance. That's just the way he talks, one of Izaka's group says. The impulsive Yasukawa, though, is more distrustful and exclaims that Sanjuro is monstrous. So we get a little bit of screen time devoted here to the factions within the group that have emerged. And we're setting up Kuni Tanaka's great line. And that will give us the transition to this splendid sequence of Mifune stalking toward Moroto's gate. The ground-level framing of his back, the swaggering walk and characteristic roll of the shoulders, the Masaru Sato score, all of these are an explicit carryover from Yojimbo, and they ought to dispel any doubts about whether it's the same character in both films. Several of the most dramatic sequences in the earlier film featured exactly this action, our hero's swagger set to music, and filmed exactly this way. Kurosawa is going to continue his unusual wide-angle framings with this wonderful shot. The camera moves back and up as the gate opens, and Mifune walks right up into the lens, his back to the camera as the infantry marches out. Because the angle is so low, for much of the shot, we have an impressionistic presentation. We see only the tips of the spears. It's a really ostentatious and dramatic way of framing the action, and Kurosawa used this kind of extreme low-angle shot of samurai on horseback and troops on the march again in Kagemusha. This sequence enables us to see the extent to which this is a castle town, a military garrison. Moroto and Kikui command a sizable number of men whom they've put on the march. The backlighting here is very evocative, creating moving shadows on the door and throwing up the haze in the air in the distant background. Great composition there. I like the faded look that the building in the background has. The factional split now continues, Izaka and Yasukawa continuing their face-off with their respective followers. This scene gives us a good look at the samurai hairstyles of the period. The viewer has certainly noticed that the young samurai wear their hair differently than Sanjuro. Almost all of the young samurai, and Hanbei Moroto as well, have shaved the tops of their heads, except for their topknot. This was in keeping with samurai etiquette in the period. The importance of correct hairstyling and facial grooming was stressed in virtually all samurai codes, with a neat, disciplined appearance being highly prized. During the period of samurai wars that preceded the Tokugawa era, samurai developed the custom of shaving their heads, probably because it made the wearing of helmets easier. The practice became established as a generalized fashion style in the Tokugawa era, which is interesting because during this 200 years, peace prevailed in Japan, and samurai no longer had much to do as warriors. So keeping the top of the head shaved served as a kind of ideological function, an emblem of the warrior's status at a time when that status had become largely symbolic and ceremonial. The top of the head was shaved, and so was the remaining facial hair, and this contrasted with the practice during the earlier period of 16th century civil wars, whereby many samurai sported beards and mustaches. In Kagemusha, for example, the warlord Shingen Takeda, played there by Tatsuya Nakadai, has a beard that he frequently strokes, and his brother Nobukadu has a mustache. In Ran, the old warlord Hidetora has a goatee, and his sons Saburo and Jiro have thin mustaches. But apart from Sanjuro, in this film, none of the samurai are sporting any facial hair. Sanjuro's sideburns and scraggly beard, then, set him apart from the others and establish his outcast status. And they also link him to an earlier period of history when samurai were active as fighting men. So you could say that one sign of Sanjuro's deadly nature here is his facial hair. We've got a little time before this scene comes to its end, and it's worth using this interval to note an aspect of the characters that might strike a Western viewer as a little unusual. The wife of the Chamberlain, you noticed, had blackened teeth. That was a custom in the period to designate a woman's married status. The blackening of the teeth, in a sense, signaled that she was someone's wife. So now we go to the mansion of our chief conspirator, Kurofuji, and Sanjuro sneaking around a little bit before Moroto comes in. Nakadai enters the room, and we've got now the first extended dialogue scene between these two actors, and really it's the first such scene that takes place in the two films. In Yojimbo, Mifune and Nakadai did not have any scenes like this one. They were enemies who said little to one another. But Nakadai's character in this film is more refined and even honorable than was his character, a scurvy gangster, in Yojimbo. And much to Moroto's subsequent humiliation, Sanjuro is going to take advantage of and manipulate this refinement. Now that Moroto is seated and the two begin their dialogue, Kurosawa goes into a continuity sequence that is rather rare for him. He sets his camera at a conventional off angle to the characters, and when the cuts occur, the setups follow standard rules of continuity editing. These reverse angle shots honor the 180-degree line of action. And so we cut back and forth in reverse angle shots using this conventional grammar. You can see how familiar this looks. Kurosawa almost never does this kind of routine continuity editing. His camera setups are typically more off-angle, assertive, and uniquely positioned, and frequently they cross back and forth over the 180 line of action. So the visual presentation in this scene is quite standard and uninflected. It's not at all like the densely articulated, uniquely designed series of shots in which the young samurai watched the palanquins leaving the fortification. But the content of the scene is crucial. It pulls more layers of appearance away from the underlying reality. Moroto reveals that Kurofuji and Takabayashi are not behind the conspiracy, that it's Moroto and Kikui who want control of the clan, and that ultimately it will be Moroto who is planning, probably, to assassinate Kikui once Kikui is in control. So he offers Sanjuro an opportunity for joining this insurgency. Moroto is a fascinating character. He acknowledges that he's bad, and he describes the Chamberlain as a fine man. So he does have moral perceptions, but he's indifferent to them. Nevertheless, by the standards of an earlier period, he is an honorable samurai. During the civil wars of the 16th century, betrayal and treachery were acceptable means for capturing an enemy or seizing power. And if you were clever enough, the period's warlords, like Shingen Takeda, the protagonist of Kagemusha, might amass great power through ruthless means and then command respect on the basis of successfully holding onto it. So in this regard, Moroto is a warrior like Sanjuro. Both of these characters are out of place in the enforced peace of the Tokugawa years. They each belong to an earlier age. Now we get our first opportunity to see Moroto's prowess with the sword. Moroto will incapacitate two of the young samurai with thrusts to their solar plexus using the butt end of his wakizashi, his short sword. Samurai were daisho men, two-sword men, carrying a long and a short sword. Moroto keeps his in their sheaths and fights using only his wakizashi. He's using his sword in a way that approximates jujutsu, the use of one of Japan's oldest martial arts weapons, the jo, a stick about 4 feet long, used in thrusting or slashing moves. Mifune will also deliver a thrust to Izaka's solar plexus to disable him. This area of the body is a favored target in martial arts and hand-to-hand combat. Also known as the celiac plexus, it houses a bundle of nerves so that striking this area, halfway between heart and navel, can cause excruciating pain, a loss of breath, and spasms in the intestines. Extreme blows can be fatal, so it's a very vulnerable spot, and striking it can be incapacitating, as we're seeing happen quite a bit in the film. I love these shots. This is just an incredible shot here with the telephoto compression and the kind of smoky look that the lighting and the lenses have given to the landscape. These are my favorite shots in the entire film, this little series of dusky night exteriors here. One of the most famous samurai battles took place in the Tokugawa era, which featured a contest between Musashi Miyamoto using a sword and Muzo Gunosuke using a jo. In their first encounter, Musashi's sword prevailed, but in the second, Gunosuke's stick carried the day. So the fighting techniques that we've been seeing are venerable and highly accomplished moves that make the sword akin to a stick weapon. Now we're getting into a scene that is another repeat and variation on material from Yojimbo. Mifune tells Moroto that the Chamberlain's men are sure to attack and try to free the prisoners, and that there aren't enough guards. So he volunteers to accompany them to help out. Now, of course, he's going to be planning an ambush. In Yojimbo, Mifune lays exactly the same trap, telling one gang leader that his hostages are sure to be rescued by the rival gang, and that there aren't enough guards. He volunteers to help out and instead slaughters the guards, which is exactly what he's planning to do here. More of these low-angle shots that kind of heroize the character of Sanjuro. And so when he goes outside, we get some more of those wonderful smoky exteriors with the exquisite lighting. And Kurosawa will handle the fight with elegant simplicity, filming it in one shot with no editing. Sanjuro walks past the guards and pulls his katana from its sheath. He makes a tsuki, or stabbing motion, into the chest of the man directly behind him. He then makes a sideways cut, a yohogiri, across the chest of another guard and finishes him off with a gyaku kesagiri, a diagonal slash upwards across his chest. And he then took out the third man with a kesagiri, a down diagonal across his chest, followed by another sideways slash to finish off the first man. And then without breaking the shot, Kurosawa panned to follow Mifune as he ran back to report the deaths. So it's really virtuoso filmmaking. You can see more of these characteristic hot spots on the walls of the sets here. Kurosawa loved creating these with his lighting, and he does it consistently throughout his period films. Sanjuro says, "No way I could have killed all of these men so quickly." And Moroto goes down to check, and we get another really fabulous shot. I really like that one. Kurosawa outdoes himself in this section of the film, responding aesthetically as a filmmaker with great excitement to these scenes of physical action. Sanjuro is a gentler film than Yojimbo, but at the same time it has a higher body count. There are actually more sword fights in Sanjuro than in Yojimbo. We've got 5 confrontations in this film compared with 3 in Yojimbo. And the fight that we're setting up for now is the longest and most expansive one of all. Sanjuro is going to kill just about everybody in this scene. It's his most egregious violation of the old lady's suggestion that he aimed to avoid violence. The widescreen frame that Kurosawa is using here was a natural one for him. You can see how effortlessly he fills it and how it lends itself superbly well to the swordplay. In this period of his work, Kurosawa was one of the world's great masters of widescreen filmmaking. He used it for the first time in The Hidden Fortress in 1958, and then continued using it on every film up through Redbeard. Now, the fight that we're coming up on is going to be more complex in its staging, and Kurosawa will shoot with several cameras running simultaneously. The first edit, which is fairly visible, is between 2 cameras at right angles to one another, but subsequent edits are more subliminal, particularly a series that occurs when Mifune moves near the gate and fights there. We're hearing a lot of swords slashing into kimonos and flesh here. Actually, what's being done is that a poor old chicken is being chopped apart by a sound man. It's an already dead chicken, but what we're hearing are the sword cuts into the meat of the poultry. This was one of the innovations in Yojimbo. Kurosawa added sound effects of sword hits into flesh. They weren't very loud in that film, but they added an extra oomph to the fights, and he carried them over into this film and made them much more aggressive. Another of Yojimbo's innovations was the Arterial Spurt, and thus far our fights in Sanjuro have been bloodless, but Kurosawa's got a trick in store for us. He's got a spectacular Arterial Spurt that he's saving for the end of the film. Now, one of the most interesting things about the scene we've just seen are the cries of the victims. They really cry and whimper as Sanjuro slaughters them. And that's a significant addition to the scene that adds a layer of complexity to what otherwise, in the hands of a lesser filmmaker, would have simply been an action sequence. There is a human cost here, and Kurosawa points toward it. The moral of this film is that the best swords remain in their sheaths. Kurosawa has used the character of the old lady to question a too ready embrace of violence, and he's used the character of Kimura to highlight the humanity that violence otherwise sacrifices. So after the slaughter, Sanjuro is angered by what he's done, partly because it was in response to the foolishness of the young samurai. Their incautious embrace of Bushido has required that he respond in a similar fashion, trapping him for once in the social codes that he has sought to escape. With the return of Maroto, we get another reprise and variation on material from Yojimbo. In that film, Mifune arranged the slaughter artfully to convince the Yakuza boss that it was a whole gang of men who attacked. And he's done the same thing here, with the humorous addition of offering himself as a victim tied up amidst the carnage. It was cold filming at night there. You can see Mifune's breath hang in the air when he's untied. Now, Maroto is no dummy. It is so improbable that the raiders would have tied up Sanjuro rather than killing him that Maroto must suspect that Sanjuro is manipulating him. After all, Maroto makes an art form out of treachery and manipulation. So he must know that Sanjuro, too, is a master of games. But he keeps his suspicions to himself for now. So Sanjuro has to show some humility here that we don't typically see from him in the film. And he wanders off, leaving the suspicious Maroto there. Chastened and humbled by their experience, we can see that the young samurai now adopt a more deferential posture towards Sanjuro than we've seen for some time. As he lectures them, we hear the uguisu. The bird's song will be a recurring motif in scenes set on the adjoining properties of the two samurai mansions. And Mifune reprises a funny little gesture that he used in Seven Samurai here, where he pretends to be an old man and uses his sword like a cane. As used in each film, it's a gesture of ridicule. These camellias that you see are not real. They were made by production designer Yoshiro Muraki's crew. The mansion grounds are indoor sets, and the camellias are manufactured to dress the sets. Kurosawa uses the stream and the falling camellias to create a very graceful transition between the two properties, as the action in this section of the film switches back and forth between the two. The drifting camellia, which has elicited an appreciative aesthetic reaction from the two women, recalls the usage Kurosawa made of a stream and a drifting wooden clog in his first film, Sanshiro Sugata. But he quickly motivates the use. The drifting camellia reveals the hostage note. His storytelling in Sanjuro, as in Yojimbo, is very crisp. While these are not exactly fast-paced movies, they are very focused, economical, story-driven films, which lack the long, slow-paced interludes that are more typical of Kurosawa's narratives. Kurosawa is having fun and is enjoying his role as a storyteller, and he makes his camera work and direction serve the story. Kurosawa uses the uguisu in a musical way, making its lilting song underscore the women's realization of the note's importance. He dubbed in the bird's cry just after Chidori's exclamation in response to the note having been signed in blood. The bird call takes the place of a musical cue that Masaru Sato otherwise might have been asked to supply, and it's ideally suited to do this because it is fast-paced and clearly punctuated as a sequence of sound. This, too, is an extension of the aesthetic style of Yojimbo. We didn't hear the uguisu in that film because the season in the story was wrong, but Kurosawa used ambient sound effects in a very musical way. These included the sound of a horse's hoofbeats as a percussive extension of the rhythms of Sato's score. And before the scene is over, Kurosawa will use the bird call again as an exclamation point in the action. First, we see Izaka deducing from the note that his uncle is evidently being held next door, and the samurai again resolve to take action. But they are being impetuous, and Kurosawa has held back Sanjuro's whereabouts until he closes the sliding screen, and we get a cut that reveals Mifune seated by the entryway. Right here. Sanjuro, of course, has seen through the ruse, and he knows that Kikui and Maroto are waiting in force next door for a rescue attempt, so he invites them to take a look. This composition is another of those in the film that use space, position, and orientation to contrast Sanjuro with his protégés. And now when one does go outside to take a look, he clambers up to the wall, And Kurosawa drops in the Uguisu's call, timed to coincide with the cut to a close view of the young samurai moving to peer over the wall. And now we get a great boom shot. We don't often see these in Kurosawa's work. He does a lot of ground-level tracking shots, but we don't often have cameras moving up and down through space on a boom. This is a fun perspective. It suddenly enlarges our view and our sense of the size of the military forces commanded by Maroto and Kikui and arrayed against our heroes. And the jaunty percussive musical score underlines the march. The Chamberlain is a stubborn man, and he's been a kind of shadow figure in the story thus far. We've not met him, and yet his welfare has been motivating all of the action. Kurosawa could have introduced him and put him in one or more scenes, but Kurosawa has deliberately kept him off-screen. And so all of the interrogation scenes are ones that the story leaps over. Kikui, for example, now brings Kurofuji and Takabayashi an indictment that the Chamberlain has written instead of the confession that they're expecting. Kurosawa's venerable character actors, Takashi Shimura and Kamatari Fujiwara, have very little dialogue in the film, but they effectively convey their characters' distress here. Look at Fujiwara in particular. These grimaces that he does recreate some of the grimacing he did to great comic effect in The Hidden Fortress, where he played a spindly gutter-snipe peasant. His reactions here are not quite as funny, but they're just as colorful. Kurosawa is shooting some of these interior scenes with shorter focal length lenses than he typically uses. This one, for example, begins with a static composition, everyone seated, and then Kurosawa breaks it up with movement. Mifune stands and crosses to the foreground, and he moves very near the camera, which Kurosawa doesn't have back as far away as he customarily places it. He's got it closer to the actors than usual. It was partly out of deference to his actors that he evolved his unusual method of multi-camera filming. By shooting with numerous cameras running simultaneously and keeping them back from the action, Kurosawa was able to place his actors more in the moment of a scene than a standard filming approach would allow. He could shoot the entire scene's action in one uninterrupted take and still have footage from various setups useful for editing and even for creating montages. Treating the scene as an uninterrupted unit was good for the actors. They could play the action continuously, and Kurosawa always felt they gave better performances this way. So this scene is an example of one that was shot all of a piece. It's one continuous take with no edits to interrupt the actors' performances. The only unconventional element is that the camera is a bit closer here than was Kurosawa's norm. So we go out of the scene with another characteristic composition where the young samurai are clustered as a group compared to Sanjuro as an individual. As Kurosawa moves toward the climax of the storyline involving the Chamberlain, he cross-cuts the scheming of Sanjuro with that of the villains, dropping in this quick little insert that accentuates the deliberation and ruthlessness of Kikui compared with the weakness and vacillation of his two partners. Much to their chagrin, Kikui is resolved to force a showdown at Kurofuji's mansion. Kurosawa's dynamic blocking of the action is in fine form here to create a delicious little joke. Sanjuro tells the young men that he'll give them a signal when to attack. As he says this, he walks across the foreground, and he's answered by Chidori's mother objecting, "No, that's too wild to burn the house." Without interrupting the flow of movement, Kurosawa pulled Mifune around, making him twist nearly 180 degrees as the young samurai behind him part like a sliding shoji screen to reveal quite theatrically Chidori and her mother sitting in the depth of the shot. Kurosawa was particularly brilliant at blocking actors to create dynamically shifting zones of focus in his shots, and he did this in the most sustained way of his career during the extraordinary first section of High and Low. Now watch Mifune trace the outline on the wall there. His finger gives us an exact expression of his growing frustration over the aesthetic discussion that's evolved between Chidori and her mother. But again, this is all the seduction of appearances. His frustration is a bluff that conceals his admiration for the old lady, and he agrees to make a more artful signal than the crass violence of fire. With another flourish, we reprise the great motif from Yojimbo of Sanjuro swaggering down the street, and we get the familiar low-angle framing enhancing Mifune's stature, the camera moving with him, filling the widescreen frame with his broad shoulders, the trademark roll of those shoulders, and the musical theme. This conjunction of elements is what we might call the Sanjuro brand or emblem. It really defines the character. It's the most vivid and fondly remembered recurring bit of business in Yojimbo. And Kurosawa wisely understood that if he was bringing the character back in a second film, he should also bring back all of the cinema style around the character. So it's more than just a musical theme. Lots of recurring movie heroes have had themes. It's so effective because it's a whole complex of music, image, composition, camera movement, and the ways these serve Mifune's contribution and body language. Kurosawa is doing what for him is a lot of wide-angle shooting on this film. And here's a shot where he dollies the camera forward to bring Nakadai and Mifune into a close-up, in which they're very close to the camera. Perhaps the speed with which he shot Sanjuro accounts for the unusual amount of wide-angle work. Perhaps also it was having a cinematographer on board, Fukuzu Koizumi, with whom he had not worked before and wouldn't use again. Sanjuro is a gorgeous-looking film, but the wide-angle look is really not typical of Kurosawa in this period. So Mifune puts the game into play by hustling Maroto for the final time. Nakadai is bringing a lot of dignity to his character, and a few years later he'd have the opportunity of playing the lead role in another film version of the same novel, Shigeru Yamamoto's Peaceful Days, which Kurosawa was adapting for this film. In a very loose sense, Nakadai got to play Mifune's role there. That film was Kihachi Okamoto's Kill, released in 1968. Sanjuro is Kurosawa's first adaptation from the literary output of Yamamoto, and Kurosawa often returned to the works of this writer for subsequent films. Redbeard in 1965 and Dodeska Den in 1970 were both adapted from Yamamoto novels, and at the time of his death, Kurosawa had written several scripts from Yamamoto's books. These were filmed by other directors as a kind of tribute to Kurosawa and included After the Rain, directed by Takashi Koizumi, Doraheta, directed by Kanishikawa, and The Sea is Watching, directed by Kei Kumai. So Sanjuro marked the beginning of a long screen relationship between Kurosawa and the writer to whom he turned more often than any other for source material. Perhaps Kurosawa felt a kind of kinship with Yamamoto. They were members of the same generation, Yamamoto having been born in 1903 and Kurosawa in 1910, and they were both in downtown Tokyo on September 1, 1923, when the Great Kanto earthquake devastated the city. So Maroto is really kind of exposed here. Sanjuro is being quite disrespectful to him. Maroto has vouched for Sanjuro with Kikui and used his own prestige to gain Sanjuro entry to the inner circle of conspirators. So now when Maroto comes to ask Sanjuro to accompany them to Komyo Temple, and Sanjuro objects that he needs to be fed first, it's quite an insult to Maroto. This effrontery helps to account for Maroto's rage later on when he realizes what Sanjuro has been up to, and his demand that Sanjuro give him satisfaction in the duel. Maroto comes to feel that his honor has been besmirched. Sanjuro tries to tell him that it's not a big deal, but Sanjuro wasn't, after all, on the receiving end of these prevarications. A really nice pan-down and reverse tracking shot energizes this action of Kikui off to the temple. Samurai on horseback or on the march pouring out of a fortified gate had a special kind of ritual fascination for Kurosawa. We've got moments like that in Throne of Blood, Sanjuro, Kaigamusha, and Ran, and Kurosawa always emphasizes the opening of the gate as a massive structure. He loved the imagery of samurai on the march. But the tone of this film is always ironic, with Kurosawa turning to undercut what would otherwise be the pomposity of a Bushido-driven swordplay picture. Listen to the music here. Masaru Sato gives us a delightful jazz rock and roll inflection, reminding us that they are, after all, kids. Irritatingly earnest Boy Scouts most of the time, but kids all the same. And Kurosawa again here reminds us how common humanity is so easily lost in these conflicts born of high-minded ideals. Kimura celebrates with the young men, but then the rift reappears and he sadly retreats back to the closet. The action is a wonderful miniature that gets right to the core of the question that Kurosawa said he always came back to in his films. Why can't people be happier? In this case, we see that they can't because they can't set aside their tribal loyalties for very long. These things exert a tremendous inertial pull that undermines a more inclusive sense of common humanity. Kurosawa has assembled all of the plot ingredients of a standard issue chambara or swordplay film. But he doesn't make that kind of picture. He never has. So he goes in the direction of satire, using Sato's score and poking fun at the intrepid band of young samurai. His satirical intentions are especially clear in this climax, which is really a kind of anticlimax. Now, one can easily see how another director would handle what's going to happen next in the movie. We'd have a big stirring battle about now between the factions of the clan, led by Izaka and by Kikui and Maroto. Izaka's gang would launch a bloody and heroic rescue mission on Kurofuji's mansion, during which several would die gloriously. The Chamberlain would be rescued at sword point, and Izaka would face off with Maroto, defeating him in battle. Kikui in turn would commit ritual suicide. We'd have a courtyard full of blood and bodies. But Kurosawa gives us a courtyard full of camellias, not bodies. The only swordplay that's going to occur is the snick-snicking of camellias as they fall into the stream, creating Sanjuro's signal. So what we're going to have is a kind of anticlimax that results from Kurosawa's deconstruction of the conventions of Chambara. It's much more delicate and funny. Kurosawa is refusing to stage what the genre calls for, and he refuses to dramatize the kind of valorization of Bushido that is so typically found at this point in a Chambara. There is a very famous publicity still of Kurosawa on the set in this scene instructing his actors in the way they should handle the sword. With Mifune and Nakadai at his side, Kurosawa stands there in his glasses and cap, arm extended, rather like Nakadai was just now, holding a long sword like a samurai. When he was an adolescent, Kurosawa in fact took kendo lessons and was delighted to learn he had a famous samurai among his ancestors. So this outlook, these attitudes of respect and affection for kendo and the martial bearing of the samurai, make Kurosawa's embrace of parody and satire here all the more complex and remarkable. He loves this world, but he also sees through it and sees through the inadequacies of how it is presented on film. In his own films, he's aimed to break new ground in portraying samurai. His first real samurai picture, Seven Samurai, in 1954, was intended to be revolutionary. And Kurosawa never stopped being revolutionary, never ceased replying in his own films to the routine and unimaginative treatment on film of the samurai past. Sanjuro, then, continues the comic inflections of Yojimbo while being a more thoroughgoing parody of Chambara, in which Kurosawa aims to show us why the usual conventions of the genre are such dead ends. Now, people only get tied up the way Mifune is here in the movies. Kurosawa knows it's a hoary convention of melodrama, and so he brings it on. Sanjuro needles his captors and provokes their anxieties about the threat from next door, knowing that Kurofuji and Takabayashi are civil servants, not fighting men, and so they'll be anxious to avoid a confrontation of swords. We hear a lot more of the uguisu in this scene, but we never do see it. It's a secretive bird, more often heard than seen. Like uguisu, camellias too are a herald of spring, and their conjunction here is appropriate. But camellias are also associated with good fortune and victory, and that's exactly what they portend for Izaka's bunch. You can see a little faint lens flare there. We'll see a few more of them in an upcoming scene. That's a nice frame within a frame composition there. We've seen so many of them in this film and, of course, throughout Yojimbo also. Of course, they pop out just in time for this old guy to see them. Now, Sanjuro is going to very shrewdly offer to sell Takabayashi and Kurofuji the signal that they think they need in return for gold. And it's a character trait that we remember from Yojimbo, where he kept asking for gold coins in return for services promised. Although coins circulated widely in late Tokugawa times, the official economy was still pegged to rice, and samurai usually received their stipends in rice. However, the shogun's requirement that all lords and their important samurai spend part of the year in the capital city of Edo, which the lord of this clan is currently away doing, created an ongoing need for coins to spend there, so the treasuries of local domains often kept them on hand. So Sanjuro offers to sell them the signal. It's a very shrewd move. He's got to work them up to a sufficient frenzy, whereby it won't seem too suspicious when he gives it to them. So he provokes them by offering to sell the information, and then of course what he does tell them is totally misleading. So poor old Fujiwara gets worked up into a frenzy. And now, instead of the rousing swordplay of a battle between rival samurai factions, Kurosawa gives us this silly little anticlimax that begins with the jokey images of poor Kurofuji and Takabayashi trying to use their swords, a weapon they clearly have not picked up in many years, to avert having to fight anybody. They chop and chop and chop, not at the bodies of enemies, but at flowers, sending a load of camellias cascading into the stream. On the other side of the wall, Masaru Sato gives us another Mickey Mousing of the action, playing musically the appearance of the camellias. And then he slips into this rousing heroic music as the young samurai launch their raid. But really for them it's much ado about nothing because there is no resistance. They burst into the adjoining compound, ready to die like the Loyal 47, but the only enemies that they confront are these old civil servants, who scamper about in real terror. And look at when they corner Takashi Shimura in the pond. He looks so frail that it's hard to believe that a decade earlier he had been the mythic and magisterial leader of the Seven Samurai. Now watch the horseman here on the left. It's another wide-angle framing with the camera close to the action, and you can see him have to rein the horse in to avoid hitting the camera. And then he waits while the others go by so he can ride around it. Kurosawa had the camera on the ground for dramatic effect, and obviously he didn't feel that he needed to retake the shot with different blocking to avoid the traffic jam. Another nice boom up to this composition. As Moroto enters through the gate, we frame the action across the top of the fortified exterior. So they run back into the interior of the courtyard, and as they come in, we'll see that we've got another lens flare here that indicated there was some trouble placing the lights for the scene. Kikui and Moroto find their co-plotters caged, and they know the game is up. Nakadai is really great here. He calmly accepts the end of his ambitions, quite a pronounced lens flare there, and he gently rests the riding crop on his shoulder. He can't change his defeat, but he can get satisfaction. As he exits, Kurosawa uses the uguisu for more emotional punctuation. It points toward Moroto's rage at Sanjuro and toward Kikui's surrender to his fate. So we tilt the camera down as Kikui drops to his knees, then tilts again to follow the camellia falling to the stream, and you can see another lens flare there, off of the water this time. And we pan a little bit to follow the flower as it goes down the stream. And now we get the biggest, driest joke of the whole movie. Kurosawa brings on the man that everything has been about, the Chamberlain. His rescue, like everything else involving him, happened off-screen. But now that he's back in office, we see him in the flesh. And he turns out to be an odd-looking little fellow with an awkward, shambling gait. He's wonderfully played by Yunosuke Ito, whom we last saw in a Kurosawa film way back in Ikiru, where he played the drunken second-rate writer who takes Watanabe on a tour of Tokyo by night. Ito's performance here is just as colorful, just as shrewd. His long horse's face splendidly fulfills the premise of the movie, that appearances are deceiving, and people aren't what they seem. Mutsuta, the Chamberlain, does look buffoonish, and so we understand why Izaka and his group mistrusted his motives when he seemed not to act on their petition against clan corruption. Mutsuta reveals the depth of his character, which Sanjuro had spotted early on without ever having met him. Mutsuta had planned to respond to the corruption by forcing the conspirators to retire. This would have saved them the shame of banishment and saved Kikui from committing suicide. The rashness of Izaka's bunch kept him from playing this hand, but rather than chastise the young men, Mutsuta says the fault was his for not eliciting their trust. So he reveals himself to be a very perceptive fellow, and also a very benevolent one, a very humane man. In his humanity, a bit like the prisoner that Izaka's bunch has been keeping in the closet. The formality of these kinds of scenes anticipate where Kurosawa's films would be going in subsequent years. The kind of stiff, rigid groupings here would become really defining features of Kagemusha and Ran, very central to the style of the later pictures. So everybody looks sheepish. And now Mutsuta breaks the stiffness of the moment by telling a very endearing joke about having this face. And everybody is so touched by his humility and self-mockery, precisely the qualities that Izaka's men have lacked, that they can't help but laugh. Chidori, played by Reiko Dan, whom Kurosawa used again in Redbeard, brings the news that Sanjuro has left. He won't be attending this ceremony held in his honor. His decision to leave inflects his character a bit differently than in Yojimbo. In both films, he's a drifter, and each film ends with him on the road, walking away from the camera. In Yojimbo, his drifting is strictly a matter of being unemployed. He's a ronin with no lord to employ him. But in this film, his wandering is a sign of his wisdom, rather like a traveling monk seeking enlightenment. Now, Sanjuro, of course, isn't a monk seeking enlightenment, but his decision not to wear the honors of the clan is a deliberate one. In Yojimbo, he does not choose to be a wanderer. It's thrust upon him by circumstances. In this film, though, he does choose, and he declines the offer of fine clothing and a stipend from the clan. Like all of Kurosawa's heroes, he's not going to take the conventional path to social rewards. He remains an abstract figure, but he does see through the sham of appearances and knows that these things, the refinements of clothing and a station in life, are distractions and trivialities. I love the way that Kurosawa reveals Mifune here. He moves the camera down across to the other side of the road, and then he pans right to reveal Mifune just around the edge of that bluff. And then he reveals Nakadai as well, and we know that we're in for a splendid duel. There's Nakadai. And we get a subliminal edit here, and then a reverse field cut will bring us into the framing with its extraordinary telephoto compression here that Kurosawa will hold on for the duel itself. Now, a first-time viewer has no way of knowing just how extraordinary this is going to be. Kurosawa changed the history of the samurai film here just as he had begun to do in Yojimbo, with its spurting arteries and severed limbs. Kurosawa is now going to take it 10 steps further. Let's dispense with any comparisons to the Western. This will be a quick-draw sword fight, so yes, it's like a Hollywood Western, as Yojimbo was superficially, but it's more profoundly steeped in a Japanese aesthetic in which the silence and stillness before the encounter is all. So Kurosawa holds on this shot for an eternity with almost no movement, as Sanjuro tries to avoid the necessity of dueling with Moroto. And when it becomes inescapable and he warns the young ones to stay back, Kurosawa waits an excruciating 35 seconds before the swords are drawn. The explosion of blood that results is absolutely breathtaking, and it stunned audiences in its day. Movies didn't do this back then, but afterward copious geysers of blood became the norm in samurai films, and Kurosawa lost interest in it because it had become conventional. When he did this kind of bloodletting again in Ran, it was part of his transcendental lament over human cruelty. So here we go. Going to be an enormous geyser of blood erupting out of Nakadai's chest. And a first-time viewer to the film is really completely unprepared for this. Long, tense wait, and there it is. Sanjuro has won because he has taken Sen, the initiative. He moved according to Sen no waza. He struck faster than Moroto, and according to Dahanawaza, striking just as the opponent moves. His technique was nuki-zuke, a simultaneous draw and strike. Now, everyone watching this DVD should replay the fight using their pause and frame forward buttons, and you'll see that Mifune's sword never passes across Nakadai's chest. Mifune merely pulls the sword straight from its scabbard on the far side of Nakadai and lifts it upward. It stays away from Nakadai at all times. But the speed of the action and the telephoto lens compression makes it look convincing. That was a vat of pressurized chocolate syrup that exploded there, and there are some odd apocryphal stories about Nakadai somehow not knowing that this was going to happen and being surprised. But what must he have been thinking as they rigged him up? Izaka responded with callow praise for the killing. He's been well programmed by Tokugawa society, and thus the master-pupil relationship that's existed between Sanjuro and the young samurai is only going to go so far. So Sanjuro gazes at the fallen Maroto and sees himself and his own probable fate, as Kurosawa suddenly turns the comic mood of the film in a melancholy direction. But not for long. He will reprise the terse, quick ending of Yojimbo by having Sanjuro wish the young men luck and striding off down the road away from the camera with Sato's theme music playing. The youngsters aren't ready for Sanjuro to leave just yet, as empty-headed as they are with all of their ideals of Bushido. They still have some regard for their mentor, and so they run after Sanjuro, wanting him not to leave. Mifune threatens them, and they sink to their knees, and you can see some tears in Izaku's eyes as he gazes at his friend. But Kurosawa doesn't let the moment go for long. We reprise the ending of Yojimbo, and we'll not see Mifune's character again. Sanjuro strides away into the realm of myth from which he emerged. With these two films, Kurosawa reinvented the swordplay film and gave cinema its most iconic samurai character. He also showed everybody how to make a fabulous pair of bookend films, the wonderfully entertaining, historically ambitious Yojimbo, and the equally entertaining but very different sequel, Sanjuro. After Kurosawa and Mifune finished with this character, cinema was never the same again.